How do you build a railway straight up a cliff that rises 500 meters into the Ecuadorian sky? What kind of courage does it take to dangle from ropes above deadly gorges while planting dynamite into solid rock? Can human determination truly convince a mountain, one that locals had named after the devil himself, to surrender and allow passage where nature had designed only impossibility? Imagine standing at the base of a vertical granite wall in the Andes Mountains, looking up at stone that climbs toward clouds, stone that shows no natural ledges or gentle slopes, stone that had defeated every engineer who examined it, and declare that railways simply cannot ascend such terrain. Imagine being told your job requires hanging from that cliff face while drilling holes for explosives, that you'll spend your days suspended above empty air with only rope between you and a fall that offers no survival, that the dynamite you're planting might detonate early, that the rock you're clinging to might crumble without warning. Imagine accepting these conditions because the wages promise something better for your family, because thousands of other workers from Jamaica and Ecuador and Puerto Rico have made the same choice, because someone has to build this impossible railway if it's ever going to exist. The Devil's Nose Railway climbs through the Andes along a route that 3 generations of engineers had examined and rejected. British surveyors in the 1860s who returned with reports explaining why the grades were too steep and the geology too unstable, German engineers in the 1870s who reached identical conclusions about the impossibility of bridging certain gorges and tunneling through certain mountains, experienced railway builders who had constructed tracks across difficult terrain in North America and Europe, but who looked at Ecuador's geography and recognized challenges that exceeded known solutions. Yet in 1899, construction began anyway, not because someone had discovered an easy path through the mountains, but because Ecuador's leaders had decided their nation's future depended on connecting the coastal lowlands to the highland capital, regardless of what conventional engineering wisdom declared possible. For 9 years, workers carved a pathway up slopes where pathways shouldn't exist, blasting cliff faces into narrow shelves barely wide enough for track beds, spanning river gorges on steel trestles assembled at heights where wind made every rivet placement dangerous, laying rails on grades so steep that conventional locomotives couldn't climb them, installing a switchback system that allowed trains to zigzag up the Devil's Nose through a series of reversing maneuvers that gained elevation through lateral movement since straight climbing remained beyond what physics permitted. The construction consumed lives with grim regularity, workers falling from heights, dying in dynamite accidents, succumbing to altitude sickness in the thin air above 3,000 meters, losing their grip on cliff faces slick with rain, or their footing on scaffolding swaying in mountain winds. By the time the railway reached completion in 1908, it had become legendary throughout the engineering world, not as the longest railway or the most expensive or the one that carried the most freight, but as the most difficult track ever constructed. The project that required inventing solutions to problems that had never been encountered before. The railway that proved human beings could build in places where nature had designed construction to be impossible. More than 115 years later, the Devil's Nose Railway still operates, still carries passengers up the switchback zigzags, still demonstrates that what one era calls impossible, another era can make permanent. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let this railway's story carry you into dreams, A tale of workers who accepted deadly risks for wages that might change their families' futures, of engineers who designed innovations that textbooks hadn't described, of a nation that refused to let mountains dictate its destiny. Close your eyes and imagine the Andes at night, the silence of ancient stone, the stars above volcanic peaks, the railway climbing through darkness toward the highlands, steady, permanent, impossible, made real. Welcome to the sleepy structures, where the world's greatest construction achievements become gentle companions for your journey into sleep. This channel explores bridges, dams, railways, and monuments through calm storytelling that honors the patience and dedication these projects required. Not through dramatic narration that creates tension, but through peaceful exploration of how impossible dreams became permanent reality. Let yourself relax, settle into comfort, and allow this impossible railway's story to carry you toward the sleep you're seeking. Ecuador existed in the late 1800s as a nation divided by its own geography, a country where the political capital and the commercial center remained separated by mountain ranges that made communication slow, trade expensive, and national unity more theoretical than practical. Quito sat high in the Andes at 2,050 meters elevation, a city founded by Spanish colonizers in 1534 in a valley surrounded by volcanic peaks, a place where thin air and cool temperatures created a climate completely different from the tropical coast, a capital that housed government institutions and highland communities but remained isolated from the ports and international commerce that drove Ecuador's economy. Guayaquil sprawled along the Guayas River near the Pacific coast at sea level, the nation's largest city and busiest port, a place where ships arrived from Europe and North America carrying manufactured goods and departed loaded with Ecuador's exports, a commercial hub that generated wealth but lacked the political authority that resided in distant Quito. Between these two cities lay roughly 450 kilometers of the most challenging terrain the Andes could offer. Mountains rising above 4,000 meters, valleys carved by rivers that became raging torrents during rainy season, slopes covered in cloud forest, where constant moisture turned soil into mud that swallowed pack animals, gorges dropping hundreds of meters to rocky streams below, and climate zones that shifted from tropical heat to freezing cold within a single day's travel. The journey between coast and highlands in the 1890s required 2 to 3 weeks by mule train, along trails that couldn't properly be called roads. Narrow paths that climbed and descended through elevation changes that left travellers and animals exhausted. Routes that became impassable when landslides buried passages or rivers flooded crossings. Passages where a misstep meant tumbling down slopes with no hope of rescue. How do you govern a nation when messages between the capital and the main port take weeks to deliver? How do you build an economy when transporting goods between production regions and export facilities costs more than the products themselves are worth? These questions haunted every Ecuadorian leader who looked at maps and understood that geography had created a country where the parts couldn't effectively communicate with each other, where the highland agricultural regions that produced coffee and cacao and wheat remained separated from the coastal port that could ship these products to international markets, where imported machinery and manufactured goods arriving at Guayaquil took so long to reach highland cities that businesses simply did without rather than pay the transportation costs that made purchases prohibitively expensive. The economic impact of this geographical prison affected every aspect of Ecuadorian development. Highland farmers who grew coffee beans watched Colombian and Brazilian competitors dominate international markets, not because their coffee was better, but because their transportation systems could move products from farms to ports efficiently enough to keep prices competitive. Cacao plantations in Ecuador's coastal regions produced chocolate raw material that European factories valued, but the inability to transport this crop reliably meant that buyers often chose suppliers from other countries where shipping schedules could be predicted rather than hoping Ecuadorian mule trains would arrive before tropical heat spoiled the cargo. The highland textile industry imported wool and cotton through Guayaquil, but the cost of moving these materials up to Quito added so much expense that local weavers couldn't compete with imported finished fabrics that had travelled across oceans but cost less than domestic production, because ocean shipping moved goods more cheaply than mules climbing mountain trails. Beyond economics, the geographical separation created political challenges that threatened national unity. Highland populations who rarely saw the coastal regions developed different cultural attitudes and economic priorities from the people living in Guayaquil. Coastal communities who felt their tax revenues supported a distant government they had little connection with grew resentful of Highland political dominance, and the entire nation struggled with the basic problem that effective governance requires communication and coordination that Ecuador's geography made nearly impossible. Regional identities strengthened while national identity weakened. People thought of themselves as highlanders or coastal dwellers first, and Ecuadorians second, because the mountains between them created separation more profound than most international borders. For decades, Ecuador's leaders had dreamed of a railway that could transform weeks of dangerous travel into hours of reliable passage, a permanent steel pathway that would ignore weather and terrain, that would carry both freight and passengers with the dependability modern commerce required, that would finally unite the divided nation into an economic and political whole, capable of competing with neighbouring countries that hadn't been cursed with such challenging geography. President Gabriel García Moreno first championed the railway idea in the 1860s. He commissioned British engineers to survey possible routes and received reports that confirmed what seemed obvious to anyone who looked at the mountains. The grades were too steep for conventional railway construction. The unstable geology of volcanic slopes made foundation work nearly impossible. The gorges required bridge spans longer than proven technology could safely construct, and the cost would exceed anything Ecuador's limited treasury could afford. The British engineers identified one obstacle in particular that seemed to summarize all the project's impossibility in a single geographical feature. About 100 kilometers inland from Guayaquil, where the coastal plain ended and the serious climbing began, a rock formation rose nearly vertically from the valley floor. The locals called it Nariz del Diablo, the devil's nose, and the name fit perfectly. The cliff face climbed roughly 500 meters of almost sheer granite. No natural ledges wide enough for a railway bed, no gradual slopes that might allow the kind of steady climbing grade that trains required, just vertical stone that blocked the obvious route as effectively as a wall built specifically to prevent passage. The British surveyors examined the devil's nose from every angle and reached unanimous conclusion. No railway could climb this barrier, and any route that went around it would add so many extra kilometers through equally difficult terrain that the entire project became economically absurd. German engineers arrived in the 1870s with the same assignment: survey the route, determine feasibility, estimate costs. They spent months in the mountains, examined alternative passages, consulted with local guides who knew every trail and river crossing, and returned to Quito with reports that matched the British conclusions almost word for word. The Devil's Nose was insurmountable by conventional railway engineering. Alternative routes multiplied the difficulties without solving the fundamental problem, and attempting construction with existing technology would likely result in bankruptcy and failure. The German team leader wrote in his final report that building a railway through this terrain would require either madness or genius, and possibly both. Yet the dream persisted because the need grew more urgent with each passing year. Neighbouring Peru completed a railway from its coast to highland regions in the 1870s and immediately saw economic benefits that made Ecuador's continued isolation more painful by comparison. Colombia began railway projects that promised to connect its various regions more effectively than mule trains ever could. Even Bolivia, landlocked and mountainous, pursued railway construction that suggested Ecuador's geographic challenges weren't unique, only uniquely unsolved. How long could Ecuador remain competitive if every neighbouring nation developed modern transportation, while Ecuadorian commerce continued depending on pack animals and trails that hadn't improved since colonial times? The political transformation of 1895 brought new energy to the railway dream. Eloy Alfaro seized power through a liberal revolution that promised modernization and progress, and he immediately declared that building the railway would be his administration's defining achievement, regardless of what previous surveys had concluded about impossibility. Alfaro understood that national development required taking risks that more cautious leaders avoided. He secured loans from North American investors who saw profit potential in a railway that would open Ecuador's interior to commerce. He negotiated with construction companies that had built difficult railways in the Rocky Mountains and other challenging terrain, and he announced that work would begin in 1899 with or without the approval of engineers who claimed it couldn't be done. The contract went to the Guayaquil and Quito Railway Company, an American firm that brought engineers experienced in mountain railway construction, but who had never encountered challenges quite like Ecuador's combination of extreme grades, unstable geology, tropical climate, and that vertical cliff face that everyone called the Devil's Nose. The chief engineer, Archer Harmon, examined the route with his survey teams and acknowledged what all previous surveyors had recognized. This would be the most difficult railway construction project attempted anywhere in the world. It would require innovation and methods that hadn't been proven in other locations. It would take years longer and cost far more than ordinary railway work, and success was far from guaranteed. But unlike the British and German engineers who had decided impossibility meant they should recommend against attempting the project, Harmon decided impossibility simply meant they needed to invent solutions that didn't yet exist. By 1899, all the preliminary work was complete, surveys finished, routes selected as carefully as the terrain allowed, funding secured through loans that would burden Ecuador for decades, contracts signed with companies that would supply steel rails and locomotives and construction materials, and recruitment beginning for the thousands of workers who would be needed to transform engineering drawings into an actual railway climbing through the Andes. The project that 3 decades of experts had declared impossible was about to begin. And the first challenge facing the engineers wasn't deciding how to climb the Devil's Nose, but rather planning a route that could even reach that notorious cliff face, a route that would require solving problems about gradients and curves and foundations and supply logistics before construction crews ever confronted the vertical barrier that had given the railway its legendary reputation for difficulty. The impossible journey from coast to highlands would begin with careful planning, with engineers studying maps and surveying terrain, and asking themselves not whether the railway could be built, but rather how it might be accomplished through methods that combined existing knowledge with innovations that necessity would force them to develop. The engineers who arrived in Ecuador in 1899 brought experience from railways built through the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada. They understood steep grades and high-altitude construction. They had supervised workers blasting tunnels through solid granite and spanning gorges on steel trestles. They knew the challenges of supplying remote construction sites and managing labor forces in difficult terrain. But the Andes presented problems that North American mountain railways had never required solving. Slopes that climbed more steeply than any gradient locomotives could ascend through direct climbing. Geological instability caused by volcanic activity that made foundation work unpredictable. Tropical weather patterns that brought rainy seasons lasting months and turning mountainsides into rivers of mud. And that one particular obstacle that dominated every planning conversation, the Devil's Nose cliff that rose nearly vertical from the valley floor, exactly where the most logical route needed to pass. Archer Harmon established his headquarters in Guayaquil and assembled survey teams that would spend months exploring every possible route between the coast and Quito, measuring grades with precision instruments, testing soil and rock composition to understand foundation requirements, identifying water sources that could supply steam locomotives, locating sites where stations and maintenance facilities might be built, calculating curve radiuses that would allow trains to navigate around slopes and through valleys. The work proceeded slowly because the terrain fought every measurement. Slopes too steep for survey equipment required building temporary platforms. Valleys filled with vegetation hid geological features that needed examination. Rivers that seemed calm during dry season became impassable torrents that destroyed survey markers during rains. And the constant elevation changes exhausted men carrying heavy instruments up and down mountains day after day. How do you design a railway route through terrain that seems specifically created to prevent railway construction? The fundamental problem was mathematical. Trains climbing grades steeper than about 5% required so much locomotive power that operational costs became prohibitive. Yet the elevation gain from sea level to Quito's 2,150 meters over just 450 kilometers of horizontal distance meant average grades would exceed this limit even on a perfectly straight route. But straight routes didn't exist in the Andes. Every valley required descending before the next climbing section. Every mountain spur forced the route sideways before continuing upward. Every river gorge demanded either bridging or detouring around, and all these necessary deviations added distance without reducing the total elevation that needed to be gained. The survey teams identified the route's natural division into sections that presented different challenges. The coastal section from Duran to the mountain foothills could follow relatively gentle grades through tropical lowlands, where the main difficulties would be river crossings and maintaining track beds through soil that turned swampy during rainy season. The middle mountain section would climb through cloud forest on slopes steep enough to require constant curves that would slow train speeds, but remained within the range of conventional railway engineering. But then came the section everyone dreaded, the approach to an ascent of the Devil's Nose, where the terrain became genuinely vertical and where conventional engineering simply had no answer for how trains might climb a cliff face that offered no natural passage. The Devil's Nose itself stood as a geographical feature that seemed designed by nature to test whether human determination had limits. The rock formation rose roughly 500 meters in less than 1 kilometer of horizontal distance, creating an average grade approaching 50% that no locomotive could possibly climb through direct ascent. The cliff face was Andean granite, ancient volcanic rock that had cooled and hardened millions of years before humans existed. Stone that was solid and strong enough to support structures if you could figure out how to attach them, but also stone that was smooth and vertical in ways that offered no natural ledges or shelves where track might be laid. Looking up at the Devil's Nose from the valley below, even experienced railway engineers struggled to imagine how steel rails might be placed on that face. There simply wasn't room for the kind of gradual climbing path that railway operations required. Local indigenous communities who had lived in the region for generations regarded the Devil's Nose with the kind of respect that borders on superstition. Their name for it, Nariz del Diablo, reflected beliefs that the rock formation possessed supernatural significance, that it served as a guardian placed by forces that wanted the highlands to remain separate from the coastal lowlands, that attempting to conquer this barrier would anger spirits that protected the mountains. The legend varied in details depending on who told it, but the core story remained consistent. When viewed from certain angles at certain times of day, the rock's profile resembled a face in stone, a devil's face with a prominent nose jutting out from the cliff, a warning carved in granite that some places existed beyond human authority to cross. Whether the engineers believed in supernatural guardians or not, they respected the indigenous knowledge about the mountain's dangers. Local guides warned about sections of cliff that looked solid but would crumble when disturbed, about weather patterns that could change from clear to deadly within hours, about altitude sickness that affected people differently, but affected everyone who climbed too high too fast, about the rainy season that made rock faces slick and treacherous. The Quechua people who inhabited these mountains had trails that went around the Devil's Nose through longer routes that added days to journey times. They had never attempted to go directly up or through the formation, because experience had taught them that some barriers deserved detours rather than direct confrontation. Yet direct confrontation was exactly what the railway required. Detouring around the Devil's Nose would add so many extra kilometers through equally difficult terrain that the project's cost would multiply beyond what investors would accept, and the extra distance would increase travel times enough to reduce the railway's economic advantage over existing mule train routes. The engineers needed a solution that would climb the cliff without adding excessive distance, that would work within the physical limits of locomotive technology, that could be built by workers using construction methods available in 1899, and for months no one could imagine what that solution might look like. The innovation emerged gradually through conversations between engineers, studying the problem from different angles. If trains couldn't climb straight up because the grade was too steep, what if they climbed diagonally across the face, gaining elevation through lateral movement? If one diagonal climb wasn't enough to gain the needed height, what if the train reversed direction and climbed another diagonal in the opposite direction? What if the railway zigzagged up the cliff face through a series of reversing climbs, with each diagonal section maintaining a grade steep enough to be challenging but not impossible, with the total elevation gain achieved through the accumulated height of multiple zigzag segments. The switchback system wasn't entirely new. Railways in Switzerland and other mountainous regions use similar techniques on a smaller scale, allowing trains to reverse direction at specific points to gain elevation that couldn't be achieved through direct climbing. But no one had attempted switchbacks at the scale the Devil's Nose required. The cliff face was too high. The grades would be steeper than any existing switchback railway. The engineering tolerances would be tighter because mistakes at these heights meant fatal consequences, and the entire system would need to function reliably enough for regular commercial service, rather than occasional tourist operations. How do you build track on a vertical cliff face when there's no natural shelf to support it? How do you ensure trains can safely reverse direction on steep grades where loss of control means disaster? The answers required accepting that this railway would need to be carved into existence through methods more aggressive than ordinary construction. Workers would need to blast the cliff face with dynamite to create artificial shelves where track could be laid. The switchback points would need to be carefully engineered with precise gradients that allowed trains to stop and reverse without rolling backward. Safety systems would need to prevent runaway trains on grades where gravity constantly pulled downward, and the entire structure would need to withstand the earthquakes that periodically shook this volcanic region. The engineering drawings that emerged from months of planning showed a route that climbed the Devil's Nose through a series of zigzags. The train would ascend diagonally across the face from left to right, gaining elevation gradually, reach a switchback point where track curved around to reverse direction, then climb diagonally from right to left on a parallel track above the first section, reach another switchback and reverse again, continuing this zigzag pattern until reaching the top of the cliff where conventional railway construction could resume. The route from Duran to Quito would total 464 kilometers. It would include 87 tunnels blasted through solid rock where no other passage existed, more than 100 bridges spanning rivers and gorges, countless sections of track carved into cliff faces or built on artificial shelves created through dynamite and determination, and that signature achievement that would make the railway famous throughout the engineering world. The Devil's Nose switchbacks that would allow trains to climb where climbing seemed impossible. The cost projection suggested the railway would require approximately $25 million, or in 1899 dollars, an enormous sum that would burden Ecuador with foreign debt for generations, but a cost that leaders like President Alfaro considered worthwhile if it finally connected the divided nation. By late 1899, planning was complete enough for construction to begin. Contracts were signed with workers beginning to arrive from Jamaica and other Caribbean islands. Steel rails were being manufactured in the United States for shipping to Guayaquil. Dynamite suppliers were preparing shipments of the explosives that would be needed in quantities larger than any previous South American construction project had required, and engineers were finalizing the detailed specifications for how the impossible would be accomplished through careful coordination of labor and materials and innovations that would be developed through necessity as the work progressed. The railway that 3 decades of experts had declared unbuildable was about to transform from engineering drawings into physical reality, and the workers who would perform this transformation were gathering in coastal camps, preparing for the journey into the mountains where they would spend years creating something that would outlast them all, something that would prove that human ingenuity guided by determination can overcome barriers that nature designs to be permanent, even barriers that local legend has named after the devil himself, as warning that some places should remain unconquered. Building a railway through the Andes required thousands of workers willing to accept conditions that combined genuine danger with isolation in remote mountains, where medical care was primitive and rescue from accidents often impossible. Yet when recruitment began in 1899, labourers arrived from across the Caribbean and South America, drawn by wages that promised something better than the poverty that defined life in Jamaica's rural parishes, Puerto Rico's struggling economy, or Ecuador's own coastal communities where work was scarce and payment unreliable. The Guayaquil and Quito Railway Company established recruitment offices in Kingston, Bridgetown, San Juan, and other Caribbean ports. Agents explained the work honestly enough that no one could claim they hadn't been warned, describing mountain construction at high altitude, dangerous conditions involving dynamite and cliff work, years of commitment required before the project reached completion, but also mentioning daily wages of $1 to $2 that exceeded what agricultural labourers or dock workers could earn in most Caribbean locations. The workers who signed contracts came from diverse backgrounds that reflected the economic desperation driving late 19th century labour migration. Jamaican men who'd worked on banana plantations or in bauxite mines, Barbadian labourers experienced with sugarcane cultivation, Puerto Ricans seeking opportunities after the island's transfer from Spanish to American control in 1898, Ecuadorian coastal workers familiar with tropical heat but unprepared for mountain cold, and smaller numbers from Trinidad, Panama, and various South American countries. They spoke different languages, English in various Caribbean dialects, Spanish in regional variations, indigenous languages among the Quechua workers recruited from highland communities. And this linguistic diversity would create communication challenges throughout construction, as foremen struggled to give instructions that everyone understood, and workers tried to coordinate tasks when they couldn't easily talk to each other. The journey from Caribbean recruitment centres to Ecuadorian construction sites began with ship passage to Guayaquil. Workers crowded onto vessels that carried them across the Caribbean and down South America's Pacific coast, voyages lasting 1 to 2 weeks depending on weather and ports of call, time spent in conditions that foreshadowed the difficult living situations they would encounter in mountain work camps. From Guayaquil they travelled inland by whatever transportation existed. Initially by foot or mule along the trails that the railway would eventually replace, later by train on completed sections of track that allowed workers to reach more distant construction zones without spending weeks hiking through mountains carrying all their possessions. At peak construction, more than 4,000 workers laboured on the railway simultaneously, spread across hundreds of kilometres from coastal sections where foundation work proceeded through tropical heat, to middle mountain zones where cloud forests kept everything perpetually damp, to high altitude sites where thin air made every physical task more exhausting, and where temperatures dropped below freezing at night even though Ecuador sat on the equator. How do you organise and supply 4,000 workers scattered across remote mountain locations accessible only by trails or partially completed railway? How do you feed them, house them, provide medical care when injuries occurred with the frequency that dangerous construction guaranteed, maintain discipline and coordination across such distances and among such diverse populations? The company established work camps at intervals along the route, temporary communities that grew and shifted as construction progressed, settlements that housed anywhere from 50 to several hundred workers depending on the section's labour requirements. The camps consisted primarily of canvas tents that provided minimal shelter, protection from rain but little defense against cold at high altitude, space for sleeping but no privacy or comfort, structures that could be dismantled and moved when work advanced to new sections. Some camps achieved a degree of permanence when construction stalled at difficult sections for months. Workers built more substantial shelters from lumber and stone, created communal cooking areas, dug latrines at safe distances from living quarters, established routines that transformed temporary camps into small villages, complete with informal hierarchies and social structures. Life in these mountain camps followed rhythms dictated by construction needs and natural limitations. Workers rose at dawn when light made cliff work and dynamite operations visible enough to be performed with some degree of safety. They worked until dusk made continuing dangerous. They spent evenings around campfires eating meals prepared from supplies brought up by mule train, or carried on the workers' own backs from supply depots. The food was basic: rice, beans, dried meat when available, bread when camps had ovens, coffee or tea, occasional fresh vegetables if the location and season permitted. The diet provided calories, but lacked variety or the nutrition that heavy physical labor at high altitude demanded. Workers lost weight, their bodies depleted by exertion that burned more energy than camp food could replace, their health compromised by dietary deficiencies that made them vulnerable to diseases that swept through camps periodically. The altitude itself became an invisible challenge that affected every worker differently, but affected everyone eventually. At 2,000 meters elevation, the air contained roughly 20% less oxygen than at sea level, and construction reached zones above 3,000 meters, where oxygen levels dropped to 30% below coastal normal. Caribbean workers accustomed to sea level experienced soroche, altitude sickness, with symptoms ranging from mild headaches and fatigue to severe cases involving nausea, dizziness, difficulty breathing, and cognitive impairment that made dangerous work even more hazardous. The human body can adapt to altitude through time. Red blood cell production increases to carry oxygen more efficiently, breathing rate adjusts, metabolic processes shift. But adaptation requires weeks that construction schedules didn't allow for rest and gradual acclimatization. How do you blast dynamite when thin air makes you lightheaded and clumsy? How do you maintain concentration on cliff faces where mistakes prove fatal, when altitude robs your mind of the sharpness that safety requires? Workers pushed through these challenges because wages depended on productivity, and because stopping meant losing income that families in Jamaica or Puerto Rico depended on. Money sent home through remittance systems that transferred a portion of each worker's pay to relatives waiting in Kingston or San Juan or Bridgetown. Funds that made the difference between survival and destitution for households that had sent their strongest members to Ecuador with hope that construction wages might finally provide escape from generational poverty. The dangers that workers accepted as conditions of employment went beyond altitude sickness. The work itself carried risks that manifested daily in injuries ranging from minor cuts and bruises to catastrophic accidents that killed instantly or left workers crippled. Dynamite work on cliff faces combined multiple hazards. The explosives themselves could detonate prematurely if handled incorrectly, or if the percussion caps that triggered blast malfunctioned, the rock being blasted could fracture unpredictably, sending shards flying at lethal velocities. The cliff faces where workers hung from ropes could crumble without warning, dropping men hundreds of meters to certain death below. Even routine tasks like moving materials or laying track carried constant hazard. Heavy steel rails could slip and crush feet or hands. Workers lost footing on steep slopes and tumbled down mountainsides. Tools dropped from heights became deadly projectiles that could kill anyone working below. The camp hospitals established at major construction sites offered medical care that was primitive by any standard. Canvas tents with a few cots, supplies of bandages and basic medications. Perhaps a doctor, or more often just someone with rudimentary medical training who did his best to treat injuries and illnesses that proper hospitals would have struggled to address. Serious injuries meant death more often than recovery. A worker who fell from a cliff and survived the impact might die from internal bleeding that the camp doctor couldn't diagnose or treat. Someone who developed infection from a minor cut could succumb to sepsis before antibiotics that didn't exist in 1899 could have saved him. Altitude sickness in severe cases caused brain swelling that killed without intervention more sophisticated than mountain camps could provide. Yet despite these conditions, the work camps developed their own communities and cultures. Workers from the same islands or regions formed social groups that provided support and companionship. Informal leaders emerged who mediated disputes and organized leisure activities during rest days, gambling and storytelling and music-filled evening hours, when exhaustion from the day's labor had faded enough to allow socializing. Jamaican workers brought songs and jokes that echoed across mountain valleys at night. Puerto Rican laborers shared stories about homes they missed and wondered when they might return. Ecuadorian workers tried to explain mountain weather patterns to Caribbean men who had never experienced frost or the sudden temperature drops that came with altitude. Some workers brought families, women and children who followed construction into the mountains, creating households in tents pitched near work camps, forming communities that made the temporary settlements feel slightly less desolate. The women cooked meals, washed clothes in mountain streams, tended to sick or injured workers when camp hospitals couldn't accommodate everyone, and tried to maintain some semblance of normal domestic life in conditions that offered nothing normal. Children grew up in these camps, playing among piles of railroad ties and coils of steel cable, watching their fathers disappear each morning toward cliff faces and tunnels, learning early that life involved danger and that the men who left for work each day might not return that evening. The linguistic diversity that characterized the workforce created both challenges and opportunities. Communication difficulties slowed coordination when English-speaking foremen tried to direct Spanish-speaking workers, or when Caribbean laborers worked alongside indigenous Ecuadorians who spoke Quechua as their first language. But the shared experience of dangerous work in difficult conditions created bonds that transcended language. Men who couldn't easily converse learned to communicate through gestures and demonstration. They developed work rhythms that relied on visual cues rather than verbal instructions. They found that physical labor created its own vocabulary that needed no translation. By 1900, after the first year of construction, the work camp stretched along completed sections of railway from the coast into the lower mountains. Temporary communities inhabited by thousands of men and their families, settlements that would exist for years, while construction slowly advanced through terrain that fought every meter of progress. Places where workers lived and died in pursuit of wages that might change their futures, or the futures of families waiting in distant homelands. The camps rested each night beneath Andean stars. fires burning in the darkness, voices drifting across the thin mountain air, and somewhere nearby the unfinished railway waiting for tomorrow's labour that would extend it a little further toward the impossible goal of reaching Quito through mountains that seemed determined to prevent exactly that accomplishment. The Devil's Nose presented itself to workers in 1902 as a wall of granite rising nearly vertical from the valley floor, stone that had stood for millions of years undisturbed by human activity, rock faces that showed no natural ledges or shelves, a cliff that climbed 500 meters toward the sky, with slopes so steep that loose stones dropped from the top would fall almost straight down without touching the face during their descent to the rocks below. The engineers had designed their switchback route on paper, diagonal climbing sections that would zigzag up the cliff, gaining elevation through lateral movement, track beds that would need to be carved into the granite to create artificial shells where rails could be laid, a system that looked elegant in drawings but that required transforming vertical stone into stepped pathways through methods that combined dynamite, rope work, and a level of danger that exceeded anything the workers had encountered during the coastal and lower mountain construction phases. How do you begin blasting a cliff face when there's no place to stand while drilling holes for explosives? The work started with rope systems. Experienced riggers who had worked on bridge construction or ship masts volunteered or were assigned to be lowered down the Devil's Nose face on hemp ropes secured to anchors at the cliff top, their bodies suspended above empty air with only the rope and the skill of the men controlling it, preventing fatal falls to the rocks hundreds of meters below. These initial riggers carried hammers and steel drill bits, hand tools that seemed absurdly inadequate for the task of drilling into granite, hard enough to dull bits after just a few holes, tools that required physical strength already depleted by altitude and exertion, equipment that represented 1902 technology's best answer to the question of how you create holes in solid rock when you're hanging from a rope with no stable platform for leverage. The drilling proceeded with agonizing slowness. A worker suspended on rope would swing himself against the cliff face, brace his feet against whatever irregularities in the stone-provided purchase, and begin hammering a drill bit into the granite with strikes that had to be forceful enough to make progress, but controlled enough not to throw him off balance and send him spinning on the rope. Each hole required hundreds of hammer strikes, the bit advancing perhaps a centimetre with each series of blows, the worker's arms and shoulders burning with fatigue, sweat making hands slippery despite the cool mountain air. The constant awareness that a broken rope or a moment's inattention could mean death. The holes needed to be deep enough to hold dynamite charges, typically 30 to 50 centimetres depending on the blast size planned, depth that might require an hour or more of continuous hammering for a single hole, and each section of cliff required dozens of holes drilled in patterns calculated to fracture the rock in ways that would create shelves rather than just breaking off random chunks. What thoughts occupy a man's mind while he hangs from a cliff, drilling holes that will be packed with explosives he'll later need to light? The workers who performed this labour came mostly from the Caribbean, Jamaican men who had grown up at sea level working in agriculture or on docks, labourers whose experience had never included heights or mountains or the particular terror of dangling above fatal drops while performing tasks that required concentration and strength. Some adapted to the work through necessity. They learned to control fear, developed techniques for bracing against the rock that conserved energy, found mental strategies for focusing on the immediate task rather than contemplating the consequences of mistakes. Others never fully adjusted. They performed the work because refusing meant losing wages and possibly being sent home without the money they'd promised to families. But every day brought fresh waves of anxiety that made hands shake and made sleep difficult during the few hours when exhaustion should have guaranteed rest. The dynamite itself added layers of danger to work that was already lethal enough without explosives. Nitroglycerin-based dynamite in 1902 was less stable than modern explosives, sensitive to impact and temperature, changes in ways that made handling always risky, and made transport through mountain terrain genuinely hazardous. The charges arrived at construction sites in wooden crates, sticks of dynamite wrapped in paper, each one containing enough explosive power to kill anyone nearby if it detonated accidentally. Boxes that needed to be carried up trails or partial railway sections to reach the Devil's Nose work areas. Workers handled the explosives with the kind of careful reverence people reserve for things that can kill instantly. They moved slowly to avoid jostling the crates. They kept the dynamite shaded and cool because heat increased instability. They stored it away from the camps in isolated locations where an accidental explosion would kill only the unfortunate person nearest the storage rather than destroying entire sections of the workforce. Loading the drilled holes with dynamite required workers to return to the cliff faces. The same men who had drilled the holes, or sometimes different workers who specialized in the careful task of packing explosives into stone, inserting blasting caps that would trigger the charges, running fuse lines back to safe positions where the blast could be initiated from distance and shelter. The fuses themselves presented problems. They needed to be long enough to allow the person lighting them sufficient time to reach safety before the explosives detonated, but not so long that wind or moisture might extinguish the flame before it reached the blasting caps. The workers learned through experience and sometimes through fatal mistakes. They developed standards for fuse length based on the blast size and the terrain that needed to be crossed to reach shelter. They tested fuses to ensure consistent burn rates. They established protocols for verifying that all workers had cleared the danger zone before anyone approached the fuses with a lit match or torch. The blasting itself transformed quiet mountain mornings into chaos of sound and dust. The sharp crack of dynamite detonating against stone. The rumble of fractured rock breaking free from the cliff face. The crashes as tons of granite tumbled down slopes or fell straight down to pile at the cliff base. And then the dust clouds that rose and hung in the air, making visibility impossible and breathing difficult for minutes after each blast. The workers waited in shelters or behind protective barriers while the explosions ran their sequence. Often multiple charges were set to detonate in planned order, each blast designed to fracture the rock in specific ways that would create the shelf or remove the obstruction that the engineers had identified as that day's objective. When the dust cleared enough to see, the workers emerged to examine what the dynamite had accomplished. Sometimes the blast had performed exactly as planned, creating the desired shelf or removing rock precisely as intended, but other times the explosives had fractured stone in unexpected ways that meant additional drilling and blasting would be needed to achieve the required result. How do you measure progress when a good day's work might advance the railway bed by just a few meters, and when the total distance requiring this brutal labour stretches for kilometres up the Devil's Nose? The workers marked advancement in terms that made sense at human scale. They counted holes drilled, charges placed, cubic meters of rock removed, shelf sections completed to the width and grade specifications that the engineers demanded. The specifications were precise because the railway's function depended on accuracy. The track bed needed to be level across its width to prevent trains from tilting. It needed to maintain consistent grade along its length so that locomotives would have predictable climbing requirements. It needed to be wide enough for the track itself, plus minimal clearance on both sides, and it needed to be carved deep enough into the cliff that the shelf would remain stable rather than breaking away under the weight of passing trains. Accidents occurred with grim regularity. Workers fell when ropes broke or when anchor points at the cliff top failed under stress. Riggers lost their grip when rock faces crumbled unexpectedly. Drillers were caught in premature blasts when fuses burned faster than expected, or when static electricity or impact triggered unstable dynamite, and labourers working at the cliff base were killed by falling rocks that tumbled from above without warning. The camp cemetery near the Devil's Nose work area grew steadily. Simple wooden crosses marking graves of men whose names were recorded in company ledgers if they were recorded at all. Burial sites that overlooked the railway they had died building. Final resting places for Jamaican and Puerto Rican and Ecuadorian workers whose families would never visit these remote mountain graves, because the cost and difficulty of travel made such journeys impossible. People who'd been poor before their loved ones left for Ecuador and who remained poor despite the wages that had been promised. One disaster in particular became part of the railway's tragic legend. In August 1903, a storage area holding dynamite for the Devil's Nose blasting operations exploded due to causes never fully determined. The blast killed 23 workers instantly. Men who'd been moving supplies or resting near the storage area, labourers who had no warning before the explosion turned their bodies into fragments and sent shock waves rippling through the camp. The investigation that followed produced no definitive answers. Perhaps the dynamite had degraded from improper storage. Perhaps someone had been careless with fire near the explosives. Perhaps the mountain's volcanic geology had produced some spark or heat that triggered the disaster. The result was the same regardless of cause. 23 men dead, their bodies so damaged that identification was difficult, their families receiving news weeks later through telegrams that offered condolences but no real answers about why their loved ones had died or whether their deaths had been preventable. Yet the work continued because stopping would mean acknowledging defeat and abandoning the project that had already consumed years and lives and millions of dollars. The surviving workers returned to the cliff faces after brief pauses for burial ceremonies. New workers arrived from coastal recruitment centres to replace those who had died, and the drilling and blasting proceeded in patterns that became routine despite the danger that accompanied every task. By 1904, the Devil's Nose switchback route was beginning to take shape. Shelves carved into the granite at diagonal angles that would allow the zigzag climbing pattern the engineers had designed. Sections of track bed visible as horizontal lines cutting across the vertical cliff face. Evidence that the impossible was slowly becoming real through accumulation of dangerous daily labour that transformed solid stone into pathways for steel rails. The workers who performed this transformation worked through conditions that combined altitude, danger, exhaustion, and fear into experiences that would mark them permanently. Those who survived would carry physical scars from injuries, respiratory damage from breathing rock dust and thin air, psychological impacts from witnessing deaths, and daily confronting their own mortality. But they would also carry pride in having accomplished something that experts had declared impossible. They had hung from ropes above fatal drops and drilled holes into vertical granite. They had handled explosives that could kill them instantly. They had carved a railway bed into a cliff that locals had named after the devil as warning that some places should remain unconquered. As each section of the Devil's Nose shelf reached completion, the workers moved to the next section, advancing slowly up the cliff face toward the distant summit, where conventional railway construction could resume, climbing through danger and determination toward a goal that seemed always just beyond reach, but that grew incrementally closer with every blast that fractured stone and every meter of shelf that emerged from the granite that had stood undisturbed since long before humans had imagined railways or dreamed of crossing barriers that nature had designed to be permanent. Building a railway through remote mountains required solving puzzles of supply and transportation that rivaled the engineering challenges of the construction itself. How do you deliver thousands of tons of steel rails to mountain locations when the railway that would eventually carry such cargo doesn't yet exist? How do you transport dynamite safely through terrain where a single accident could destroy an entire supply convoy? How do you feed 4,000 workers scattered across hundreds of kilometers when the nearest substantial food sources lie in coastal cities that themselves depend on imports from outside Ecuador? The answers emerged through trial and error, through improvisation that combined traditional Andean transportation methods with industrial-age logistics, through coordination that required communication systems stretched across distances that made even simple messages difficult to transmit and receive. The steel rails themselves presented the first major logistics challenge. Each rail section weighed approximately 200 kilograms and measured 9 meters in length, dimensions and weight that made handling awkward even on flat ground and nearly impossible on mountain trails. The rails arrived at Guayaquil's port aboard ships from steel mills in the United States and Britain, manufactured to precise specifications for the narrow gauge track that Ecuador's mountainous terrain required, loaded as deck cargo or in holds, offloaded at the docks by cranes and longshoremen, who moved them to storage yards near the railway's coastal terminus at Duran. From there, the rails travelled inland by the only methods available, initially by mule train, along trails that had served for centuries as the primary routes between coast and highlands, later by the railway itself once the first sections of track were completed and operational. Transporting rails by mule required ingenuity that indigenous arrieros, muleteers, had developed through generations of moving cargo through the Andes. Each rail was too heavy and awkward for a single mule to carry, so the arrieros developed systems where rails were suspended between pairs of mules walking in tandem, the weight distributed across multiple animals, the pace slow enough that the mules could navigate narrow trails without the rails catching on rocks or vegetation. A convoy of mules carrying rails moved at perhaps 2 kilometers per hour on good trail sections, and even slower where the path climbed steeply or descended through switchbacks that required careful maneuvering to prevent the suspended rails from swinging dangerously. How many days did it take to move rails from coastal storage to mountain construction sites 100 kilometers inland? The answer depended on terrain and weather. A journey that might require 5 days during dry season could take 2 weeks during rains, when trails became muddy streams, and when landslides forced detours that added distance and difficulty. As construction advanced and the first sections of railway became operational, The logistics improved dramatically. Rails could be loaded onto flat cars at the coast and transported to the current railhead. The distance requiring mule transport shrinking continuously as track extended further into the mountains, but this improvement created its own coordination challenges. The railway's advance depended on receiving rails at the construction front, yet the railway itself was the primary method for delivering those rails, creating a circular dependency that required careful scheduling. Supply trains ran during hours when construction wasn't actively using the track. Typically at night when blasting and heavy labour had ceased, locomotives pulling loads of rails and other materials toward the advancing railhead, while workers slept in camps just beyond where the track currently ended. Dynamite logistics involved dangers that made rail transport seem simple by comparison. The explosives needed to reach mountain construction sites in quantities measured in tons per month. Yet every kilogram represented potential disaster if handled carelessly or transported through conditions that made the nitroglycerin-based charges unstable. The dynamite arrived at Guayaquil in ships that carried it in specially designed holds, isolated from cargo that might create sparks or excessive heat. Even in port, longshoremen treated dynamite shipments with extreme caution, working slowly and deliberately to move crates from ships to secure storage facilities that sat isolated from the city's populated areas. The overland journey from coast to mountains initially relied on mules, specially trained animals accompanied by arrieros who understood the risks and who moved their explosive cargo with a kind of careful attention that recognized a stumble or a dropped crate could kill everyone in the convoy instantly. The dynamite convoys traveled separately from other supply trains. Company policy prohibited mixing explosives with other cargo types, and the convoys moved during daylight hours when visibility allowed careful navigation and when other trail traffic could be warned to keep distance. The arrieros who specialized in dynamite transport commanded higher wages than those moving ordinary cargo. Compensation for the risk they accepted and for the expertise required to judge trail conditions and weather patterns that might make transport too dangerous to attempt. During rainy season, dynamite shipments sometimes halted completely. The combination of wet trails, reduced visibility, and increased instability of explosives in humid conditions, creating risk levels that even the brave arrieros refused to accept. Food supply for thousands of workers presented logistical challenges different from rails and dynamite, but equally essential to construction's continuation. The workers needed roughly 3,000 calories per day to sustain the physical labor that railway building demanded, calories that at high altitude needed to come partially from carbohydrates that provided quick energy and partially from proteins and fats that sustained strength through long work days. The basic supplies came from coastal Ecuador and from imports through Guayaquil. Rice from coastal plantations, beans grown in highland valleys, dried beef and salted pork that could survive the journey to remote camps without refrigeration, flour for bread when camps had ovens and bakers, coffee and sugar that provided warmth and energy during cold mountain mornings. Moving food supplies followed patterns similar to rail transport. Mule trains carried sacks of rice and beans, barrels of salted meat, crates of coffee and other supplies along trails that climbed gradually inland from the coast. But food presented unique challenges that steel rails didn't. It could spoil if transport took too long. It attracted animals and pests that could destroy supplies before they reached camps. It required protection from rain that could ruin rice or flour. and it needed to arrive in steady flows because workers couldn't continue construction if hunger forced them to stop for lack of sustenance. The company established supply depots at intervals along the route, warehouses where food could be stored and distributed to nearby camps, stations where arriving supply trains could unload cargo that would then be transported shorter distances to construction sites, coordination points where supply officers tracked inventory and ordered replenishment before shortages halted work. How do you communicate across hundreds of kilometers of mountain terrain to coordinate supply deliveries with construction needs? The telegraph system that accompanied railway construction provided answers that transformed logistics from guesswork into manageable coordination. Telegraph lines were strung alongside the advancing track on wooden poles, the wires connecting coastal supply centres with mountain construction sites. Operators at each station transmitting and receiving messages in Morse code that conveyed information about materials needed, supplies available, transport schedules, emergency situations requiring immediate attention. A construction foreman encountering unexpected rock formations that would require more dynamite than originally planned could telegraph the supply depot requesting additional explosives, the message travelling instantly along the wires, while physical transport of the dynamite would still require days. But at least the supply system could begin responding immediately rather than discovering the shortage only when construction halted for lack of explosives. The telegraph operators became essential workers whose contributions matched the labourers drilling cliff faces or the engineers designing switchbacks. They maintained the wire systems that mountain weather constantly damaged. They learned to interpret messages despite interference from atmospheric conditions and equipment limitations. They worked irregular hours because construction emergencies didn't respect conventional schedules, and they served as the communication network that held the scattered construction zones together as a coordinated project, rather than isolated efforts proceeding independently. The telegraph stations often sat in small buildings near construction camps, wooden structures that housed the equipment and provided shelter for the operators, facilities that became social centres where workers gathered to send messages to families or to receive news from coastal cities about events in the wider world that seemed very distant from mountain construction sites. Water supply for steam locomotives presented yet another logistics challenge that shaped where the railway could run and where maintenance facilities needed to be located. The locomotives that would eventually operate on this railway consumed enormous quantities of water to generate the steam that drove their engines, water that needed to be available at regular intervals, or else trains would run dry and strand in remote locations. The engineers identified natural water sources along the route, mountain streams that could be diverted into collection tanks, springs that provided steady flow year-round, rivers where pumping stations could be built to fill the storage tanks that trains would stop at for resupply. But some sections of the route passed through areas where water was scarce, rocky slopes where streams dried during the dry season, exposed ridges where no natural water sources existed nearby, and these sections required building elaborate systems where water was pumped or transported from distant sources to storage facilities positioned where trains would need them. The coordination of all these logistics elements Rails, dynamite, food, water, telegraph communications, and countless other supplies from timber for track ties to medical supplies for camp hospitals required administrative systems that functioned despite the distances and difficulties that characterized Andean construction. Supply officers who tracked inventory and predicted needs, purchasing agents in Guayaquil who negotiated with suppliers and arranged shipping, transportation coordinators who scheduled mule trains and later railway supply runs, warehouse managers who stored and distributed materials, and the arrieros themselves whose knowledge of mountain trails and weather patterns made them invaluable guides for supply convoys navigating terrain that could kill the unprepared. By 1905, after 6 years of construction, the logistics systems had evolved into reasonably efficient operations. Supply depots dotted the completed railway sections, telegraph lines connected the construction zones, regular schedules governed the movement of materials from coast to mountains, and the workers building the railway could generally count on having the materials they needed arriving before shortages stopped progress. But efficiency came at high cost. Animals died from exhaustion or accidents on difficult trails. Supply convoys were sometimes lost to landslides or weather. Storage facilities burned or collapsed under snow loads, and the constant flow of materials required expenditures that added millions of dollars to the railway's total cost. Yet without these logistic systems, without the patient labor of moving supplies across impossible terrain, without the coordination that ensured dynamite reached the cliff blasters and rails reached the track layers and food reached the work camps, the railway would have remained forever incomplete, an abandoned dream defeated not by engineering impossibility, but by the simpler reality that construction requires materials, and that getting those materials to where they're needed becomes its own kind of construction challenge, demanding solutions as innovative as any switchback or tunnel design. The railway route between Guayaquil and Quito crossed more than 100 rivers and gorges that required bridging. Some were modest streams that could be spanned with simple timber trestles, but others were profound chasms where rivers flowed hundreds of meters below the railway grade, where wind howled up from the depths with force that could knock workers off balance, where the distance from one side to the other exceeded anything Ecuador's builders had previously attempted to span. The bridges needed to support not just their own weight, but the enormous loads of locomotives and loaded freight cars, concentrated weights that would stress the structures in ways that pedestrian bridges or pack trails never experienced. Dynamic forces from moving trains that would shake and flex the spans, and all of this needed to function reliably through earthquakes that periodically rattled this volcanic region without warning. How do you build a bridge across a gorge 200 meters deep when the bottom is accessible only by dangerous climbing, and when high winds make working at elevation deadly? The engineering solution relied on steel trestle designs that had proven successful on North American railways. Frameworks of steel beams and girders bolted and riveted together to create structures strong through geometric design, rather than through sheer mass. Bridges that distributed loads through triangulated patterns where compression and tension forces balanced. Spans that could be assembled from components small enough to transport through mountains by mule or on partially completed railway sections. The steel arrived from mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio, fabricated to precise specifications, marked with identification codes that indicated which piece connected to which others, shipped to Guayaquil and then transported inland following the same difficult routes that rails and dynamite traveled. The bridge construction began with foundation work. Workers descended into gorges by rope to reach bedrock where bridge piers could be anchored. They cleared vegetation and loose rock from sites where foundations would be placed. They drilled holes for anchor bolts using the same hand tools and methods employed on cliff faces, working in positions where the river roared below and where falling meant certain death. In water too turbulent to offer any hope of swimming to safety. The foundation work in some gorges required building temporary shelters where crews could work protected from stones and debris falling from above. Wooden platforms cantilevered out from the gorge walls, structures that themselves represented significant engineering challenges and that needed to be strong enough to support workers and equipment while they completed the foundation preparations. Once foundations were ready, the bridge erection proceeded through methods that combined mechanical advantage with human labor. Steam-powered winches and pulley systems lifted steel components from the gorge floor or the construction grade up to positions where they would be connected. Riggers guided the pieces into alignment using ropes and hand signals, and riveters drove hot rivets through pre-drilled holes to create joints that would hold the structure together under stress. The riveting work required teams of specialists, one worker heating rivets in a portable forge until they glowed red-hot, a second using tongs to throw the hot rivet to a catcher who stood at the joint location, the catcher placing the rivet through aligned holes in the steel members, and a fourth worker using a pneumatic hammer or manual tools to mushroom the rivet's end and create a permanent connection that was stronger than bolts and that wouldn't loosen from vibration the way threaded fasteners might. What kind of concentration does riveting require when you're working on a bridge beam hundreds of meters above a river gorge with wind buffeting your body and altitude making your head light? The riggers who performed this work developed specializations. Some excelled at positioning beams with a precision that proper alignment demanded. Others became expert at reading structural drawings and understanding which pieces connected in which sequence. Still others specialized in the dangerous work of walking on unfinished bridge structures without safety equipment, because harnesses and ropes interfered with the mobility that efficient work required. The pay for bridge work exceeded standard laborer wages. Recognition that the skills and risks involved deserved compensation beyond what cliff drilling or track laying commanded. Acknowledgement that replacing experienced riggers who fell to their deaths cost the project both in human terms and in delays, while new workers learned skills that required months or years to develop fully. The longest bridge on the entire railway spanned the Chanchon River Gorge, a steel trestle that stretched 217 meters from one rim to the other at a height of 105 meters above the water, a structure that consumed months of construction time and required engineering calculations that accounted for wind loads, seismic forces, thermal expansion that made the steel grow and shrink with temperature changes, and the dynamic loading from trains that would cross at speeds up to 30 kilometers per hour. The Chanchon Bridge became a symbol of the railway's ambition. Photographs of the structure under construction circulated in engineering journals in the United States and Europe. Articles described the challenges of building at such scale in such a remote location, and engineers studying the images asked themselves whether they would have possessed the courage to attempt what Ecuador's railway builders were accomplishing through determination that seemed to exceed reasonable limits. But bridges were only one of the technological systems that the railway required. The locomotives themselves represented engineering adapted specifically for the challenging grades and curves that Andean operation demanded. The railway ordered narrow-gauge steam engines from Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. machines designed for 1067mm track spacing, rather than the standard gauge used on most North American and European railways. Locomotives with smaller driving wheels that traded speed for the pulling power needed to climb grades approaching 5.6%. Engines equipped with specialized braking systems that could control descent on downhill sections, where gravity constantly pulled trains toward dangerous speeds. How much power does it take to pull a loaded freight train up a 5% grade at 3,000 meters altitude, where thin air provides less oxygen for combustion? The Baldwin engineers calculated that multiple locomotives would be required on the steepest sections, one engine pulling from the front and another pushing from behind, the two working in coordination to move loads that neither could handle alone. Communication between engine crews accomplished through whistle codes that conveyed information about speed adjustments and braking needs. The locomotives needed to be robust enough to operate reliably in conditions that combined altitude, tropical humidity in lowland sections, freezing temperatures in highland passes, and maintenance facilities that were primitive compared to the well-equipped shops that North American railways enjoyed. The braking systems became critical safety features given the steep descending grades that trains would encounter. Conventional brakes that worked adequately on gentle slopes proved insufficient where gravity accelerated trains toward speeds that could derail them on curves or send them crashing through not yet completed track sections. The railway adopted air brake technology that George Westinghouse had developed in the 1870s, systems where compressed air transmitted braking force through pipes connecting all the cars in a train, allowing the engineer to control the entire train's braking from the locomotive, providing fail-safe operation where loss of air pressure automatically engaged the brakes rather than releasing them. The air brake systems required maintenance and understanding that railway workers needed to learn. They attended training sessions where company instructors explained the pneumatics. They practiced troubleshooting common problems. They developed expertise that transformed them from simple labourers into skilled technicians whose knowledge was essential to safe railway operation. The locomotives also required constant fuel and water, coal for the fireboxes that heated water into steam, water itself to replace what was lost through the smokestacks, a steam exhaust, lubrication for bearings and moving parts, all of which needed to be available at regular intervals, or else trains would strand in locations where rescue might take days. The company established maintenance facilities and supply stations along the route, buildings where locomotives could be serviced, coal bunkers where fuel was stored, water tanks fed by mountain streams or wells, tool shops where repairs could be performed, and barracks where engine crews could rest between runs. These facilities represented substantial investments. Some required building access roads separate from the railway itself. Others needed elaborate water collection systems to ensure reliable supply. All of them added to the project's cost in ways that multiplied the basic expense of laying track and carving grades through mountains. The technology extended beyond locomotives and bridges to include signalling systems that would coordinate train movements. The railway operated as single track for most of its length, meaning trains travelling in opposite directions needed to pass at designated sidings where one would wait while the other proceeded. The coordination required telegraph communication between stations and between trains and central dispatchers who tracked movements and authorized departures. A train couldn't leave a station until the dispatcher confirmed that the track ahead was clear and that no opposing train would create a collision risk. And this communication needed to function reliably because mistakes could mean head-on crashes in remote locations where rescue would be difficult and casualties high. The workers who would eventually operate this technological system came from the same labour pool that had built the railway. Some of the more skilled construction workers transitioned into operational roles as sections of track were completed and began carrying traffic. They learned to operate locomotives and maintain equipment. They became telegraph operators and station agents and maintenance crews, transforming from builders into operators of the system they had created. The training programs that prepared them for these roles represented another logistics challenge. Instructors needed to come from coastal cities or from abroad. Training facilities needed to be established near operational sections, and workers needed time away from construction duties to attend classes, all of which added complexity to project management that already struggled with coordinating construction across hundreds of kilometres of difficult terrain. By 1906, 7 years into construction, the railway had become a technological showcase that demonstrated what early 20th century engineering could accomplish when challenged by terrain that seemed designed to defeat such ambitions. Steel, bridges spanning impossible distances, locomotives climbing grades that conventional wisdom said were too steep for railway operation, communication systems connecting remote stations, and all of it functioning in an environment where altitude, weather, and seismic activity constantly tested whether technology could truly overcome the barriers that nature had placed in construction's path. The bridges stood steady over gorges where rivers had flowed undisturbed for millions of years. The locomotives pulled their loads up slopes that mules had struggled to climb with far lighter burdens. The telegraph wires hummed with messages that travelled instantly across distances that had once required weeks to cross. And somewhere in all this technology and innovation and mechanical achievement stood the proof that human ingenuity, guided by determination and funded by resources, could indeed transform impossible into merely difficult and difficult into accomplished reality that would serve Ecuador for generations, that the builders would never live to see. The switchback system that allowed trains to climb the Devil's Nose represented railway engineering's answer to a problem that physics said had no solution. How do you gain elevation when the terrain is too steep for direct climbing? The concept was mathematically elegant. If a train couldn't climb straight up a 50% grade, then it would climb diagonally across the face at a manageable 5% grade, gaining elevation through horizontal distance rather than through vertical ascent. When one diagonal climb reached its natural limit, where continuing would mean building track that curved too sharply or extended too far from the cliff face, the train would stop, reverse direction, and climb another diagonal section in the opposite direction, creating a zigzag pattern that accumulated elevation gain through multiple reversing segments that individually remained within the operational limits of locomotive technology. But transforming this elegant concept into functioning reality required solving problems that no railway had previously encountered at this scale. The switchback points where trains' reverse direction needed to be engineered with precision that allowed safe stops on steep grades where gravity constantly pulled trains downward. The track alignment at each reversal needed to guide trains smoothly from one climbing direction to the opposite without creating forces that might derail cars or stress couplings beyond their strength. And the entire system needed to operate reliably enough for regular commercial service, where delays or failures would undermine the railway's economic purpose. How do you design a reversal point on a narrow cliff shelf, where there's barely room for the track itself, much less the additional space that switching mechanisms require? The engineers designed the switchback points as specially carved platforms, sections of track bed wider than the standard railway shelf carved deeper into the Devil's Nose cliff to provide space where the track could split into a Y configuration, with one branch continuing the diagonal climb in the current direction, while the other branch curved around to begin the next diagonal segment in the reverse direction. The switch mechanism itself was a marvel of mechanical simplicity adapted to mountain conditions. A movable section of rail that could pivot to direct trains onto one branch or the other, operated initially by hand levers that workers would throw after trains came to complete stops, locks that would hold the switch securely in position while trains passed over to prevent the mechanism from shifting under load and sending trains onto the wrong track. The construction of these switchback platforms required blasting even more cliff face than the standard track sections demanded. Workers hanging from ropes drilled additional holes, packed more dynamite, created wider shelves that consumed months of dangerous labour for each switchback point. The Devil's Nose route included 4 major switchback platforms, each one representing a reversal point where trains would stop and then proceed in the opposite direction, each one carved into the granite at elevations calculated to create the diagonal climbing sections between them at grades that remained within operational limits. The spacing between switchbacks determined how much horizontal distance would be required to gain the total elevation. Wider spacing meant longer diagonal sections and more total track length. Closer spacing meant sharper curves at the reversal points and more time consumed in the stopping and reversing process that added to journey times. What does it feel like to ride a train that climbs by zigzagging? To feel the locomotive pulling you diagonally across a cliff face, to stop at a platform carved into vertical stone, to wait while the engineer releases brakes and the train begins rolling backward up the next diagonal section, with what was the rear now becoming the front. The early test runs in 1907, when the first switchback sections became operational, revealed sensations that ordinary railway passengers had never experienced. The views from train windows showed nothing but empty air on one side and stone cliff on the other. The stops at switchback points felt precarious because the train sat on a steep grade where any brake failure would mean a runaway descent ending in certain disaster, and the reversal itself created moments of disorientation as the direction of travel changed, while the sense of climbing upward remained constant. The operation of trains through the switchbacks required coordination between multiple crew members whose timing needed to be precise. The locomotive engineer controlled the engine's power and the primary braking. A brakeman stationed at the rear of the train controlled additional brakes on the trailing cars. A conductor supervised the overall operation and communicated through hand signals or shouted commands when trains stopped at switchback platforms, and workers stationed at the switchback points operated the track switches and verified that the mechanisms were properly locked before signalling trains to proceed. How do you coordinate all these people when wind noise and the hiss of steam and the general chaos of mountain railway operation make verbal communication difficult? The crews developed a system of whistle codes and hand signals, specific patterns of short and long whistle blasts that conveyed information about intentions and status, gestures visible from distance that indicated readiness or problems, protocols learned through training and reinforced through practice until every crew member understood their role and could perform it even under the stress and distraction that difficult conditions created. The braking systems became especially critical on the switchbacks where trains stopped on grades steep enough that gravity would pull them backward if brakes failed. Each locomotive had multiple independent braking systems that could stop the train, even if one system malfunctioned. The cars themselves had handbrakes that could be set manually by brakemen to provide additional stopping force, and the switchback platforms were designed with slight upward grades at their ends, so that trains rolling uncontrolled would naturally slow as they climbed rather than accelerating into dangerous speeds. Yet despite all these safety systems, the crews operating through the switchbacks understood they were performing dangerous work. A broken coupling could separate cars on a steep grade. A brake failure could start a runaway that nothing could stop. An error in the switching mechanism could derail a train on a cliff section, where tumbling off the edge meant certain death for everyone aboard. The international engineering community watched the devil's nose switchbacks with fascination that mixed admiration with skepticism about whether such a system could operate reliably over years of regular service. Railway journals published articles describing the technical details. Engineers travelled from Europe and North America to observe the construction and early operations, and debates arose about whether Ecuador's solution represented genuine innovation or merely a desperate adaptation to terrain that proper planning would have avoided entirely. Some critics argued that a longer route that avoided the Devil's Nose would have been more practical. The additional distance would have been offset by faster operating speeds and reduced maintenance costs, and the railway would have avoided creating what might become a bottleneck, where the slow switchback operations limited the entire system's capacity. But these critics hadn't seen the alternatives. Every route that avoided the Devil's Nose added not just distance, but additional gorges to bridge, additional mountains to tunnel, additional challenging terrain that would have multiplied costs beyond what longer routes could justify. The switchback system's real validation came not from engineering journals, but from operational experience. Once the section opened to regular service, trains climbed the Devil's Nose daily without the frequent failures that skeptics had predicted. The crews developed expertise that made the reversals routine rather than adventures, and passengers who initially found the experience frightening came to regard it as an exciting feature of the journey rather than a hazard to be endured. The travel time through the switchback section was slow, perhaps 30 minutes to cover a horizontal distance that a train on conventional track might traverse in 5 minutes. But those 30 minutes gained 500 meters of elevation through terrain where no other practical method existed for climbing. The legacy of the Devil's Nose switchbacks extended beyond Ecuador. Railway engineers confronting similar problems in other mountainous regions studied the design and adapted the principles to their own situations. Switchback systems appeared on railways in Peru and Bolivia and other Andean countries, and the technique became part of the standard repertoire of solutions that mountain railway construction could employ when direct climbing proved impossible. The innovation wasn't entirely original. Swiss and Austrian mountain railways had used switchbacks on a smaller scale, and the basic concept of reversing to gain elevation was as old as trail building in steep terrain. But the Devil's Nose represented the technique's application at a scale and in conditions that tested whether theory could become practice. It proved that trains could reliably operate through multiple reversals on extreme grades, that the system could function safely despite the obvious dangers, and that what appeared impossible when viewed from the valley floor could become routine once engineering ingenuity found the method that made it work. By 1908, when the entire railway from Guayaquil to Quito approached completion, The Devil's Nose switchbacks had become the railway's signature achievement. The section that symbolized the project's ambition and difficulty. The innovation that most clearly demonstrated how engineering could overcome barriers that conventional approaches couldn't solve. The proof that human determination guided by technical knowledge could indeed carve passages through terrain that nature had designed to prevent exactly such violations of its vertical walls. Passengers who rode the railway in its early years spoke of the switchback section with the kind of reverence usually reserved for natural wonders. They described the sensation of hanging on the cliff face with nothing visible below, the strange experience of climbing through reversal rather than through straight ascent, the views from the switchback platforms that stretched across valleys to distant peaks, and the profound relief felt when trains finally reached the top of the Devil's Nose and resumed normal operations on conventional track where climbing meant moving forward rather than zigzagging through a vertical whirl that seemed to defy the possibility that trains could navigate such terrain. The workers who had carved those switchback platforms from solid granite were by 1908 scattered. Some had died during construction and rested in mountain cemeteries. Others had completed their contracts and returned to Jamaica or Puerto Rico or wherever they had come from, carrying memories of the years spent hanging from ropes above fatal drops. Still others had transitioned into operational roles and now worked as the crews who guided trains through the reversals they had built. But regardless of where they were, they shared knowledge that few people would ever possess. They knew what it took to transform impossible into real. They had experienced the particular exhaustion of drilling granite at altitude while suspended from ropes. They had witnessed the gradual emergence of the switchback system as daily. Blasting slowly created the shelves and platforms that drawings had shown as simple lines, but that required years of dangerous labor to actually carve from the Devil's Nose cliff that had blocked passage since long before humans imagined railways or dreamed of connecting coasts to highlands through steel tracks that climbed where climbing shouldn't be possible. The final section of track between the Highland Plateau and Quito's outskirts was laid in June 1908. Workers driving the last spikes into wooden ties, engineers verifying alignment and grade 1 final time, telegraph operators sending messages along the completed line, announcing that after 9 years of construction, the railway finally stretched unbroken from Duran on the coast to Chimbacale station in Ecuador's capital city. The completion came not with dramatic ceremony at a specific moment, but rather through the gradual realization that no gaps remained. Every bridge had been finished and tested. Every tunnel had been bored through and track laid within. Every switchback platform stood ready for operation, and the 464 kilometers of steel rail that connected two cities that geography had kept separate for centuries now waited for the first complete journey that would prove the railway's purpose. President Eloy Alfaro, who had committed his administration to building the impossible railway, despite expert warnings and despite political opposition from those who considered the project a waste of resources Ecuador couldn't afford, insisted on riding the first official train from Guayaquil to Quito, a journey that would take 2 days with an overnight stop at a mountain station, because continuous travel across such distances and through such difficult terrain remained beyond what early 20th century railway operation could accomplish safely. The presidential train departed Duran on June 25th, 1908, with carriages carrying government officials, foreign diplomats, journalists and engineers who had supervised construction. A procession that moved slowly through the coastal sections where crowds gathered near the tracks to watch history passing, through the lower mountain zones where workers who had built these sections stood beside the grade to see the fruit of their labour, carrying the nation's president toward the capital. How does it feel to ride a train through terrain you had crossed only by mule just years before? To sit in relative comfort while the landscape that had required weeks of difficult travel now passes at speeds that compress time and distance. The passengers on that first official journey recorded their impressions in letters and journal entries and newspaper dispatches. They described the smoothness of travel compared to mule trains that jolted over rough trails. They marvelled at bridges that spanned gorges where crossing had once required dangerous descents and climbs. They noted the engineering works visible from train windows, where cliff faces showed blast marks from dynamite, and where shelves carved into vertical stone testified to the labour that construction had demanded. But they also noted the sobering reality of the cemeteries that appeared near construction camps. The wooden crosses marking graves of workers who had died building what the passengers were now riding across in safety and comfort. The Devil's Nose section created the journey's dramatic centrepiece. The train climbed through the coastal zones and lower mountains with conventional operation, pulling steadily upward on grades that were steep but manageable, until it reached the approach to the notorious cliff that had symbolized the railway's impossibility during all the years when experts declared it couldn't be built. The passengers felt the grade steepening as the train entered the first diagonal climbing section, the locomotive working harder, the speed dropping to a crawl, the views from windows showing the valley floor falling away below while vertical granite filled the opposite windows. At the first switchback platform, the train stopped, the passengers experiencing that moment of uncertainty that comes from sitting motionless on a steep grade, hearing the hiss of steam and the mechanical sounds of brakes engaging, watching railway workers throw switch levers and signal readiness for the reversal. Then the train began moving backward. What had been the rear now leading as the locomotive pushed rather than pulled, the climb continuing in the opposite direction, the zigzag pattern becoming tangible experience rather than engineering concept. Some passengers found the sensation exhilarating, the proof that human ingenuity had indeed conquered the impossible barrier, the thrill of climbing through such dramatic terrain, the pride of witnessing what their nation had accomplished. Others found it frightening. The exposure to empty air visible through windows, the sense that the train clung precariously to a cliff where any mistake might send them tumbling to certain death, the unnatural feeling of ascending through reversal rather than through the forward motion that railway travel was supposed to involve. The journey required approximately 30 minutes to complete the Devil's Nose ascent through 4 switchback reversals, time that ordinary railways would have consumed travelling 20 kilometres or more, but time that gained 500 metres of elevation through terrain when no other method existed for climbing. When the train finally reached the top and resumed conventional forward operation, the passengers felt a collective relief that expressed itself in applause and celebration. They had crossed the barrier that had defined Ecuador's geographical prison. They had proven the railway's viability, and ahead lay the highland plateau where the remaining distance to Quito would be covered, on grades that seemed gentle by comparison to what they had just experienced. The overnight stop came at Ambato Station, a mountain city where facilities had been prepared for the presidential party, where local officials organised celebrations honouring the railway's completion, where speeches proclaimed that Ecuador had entered the modern era through this connection between coast and highlands. The following morning the journey resumed, the train climbing the final sections to Quito through landscape that combined volcanic peaks with agricultural valleys, passing through stations where crowds gathered to witness the arrival of the first complete train, approaching the capital through outskirts that had been transformed by the railways coming from isolated highland neighbourhoods into communities that would now have reliable connection to the coast and the wider world. The arrival at Chimbacala station on June 26, 1908, brought crowds estimated at 20,000 people, nearly one-third of Quito's population turning out to witness the event that symbolized their city's liberation from geographical isolation that had constrained development since colonial times. President Alfaro descended from his carriage to speeches and celebrations that continued through the day and into the evening. But the true significance of the arrival needed no speeches to be understood. Quito now had a railway connection that would transform how the city functioned. Goods that had taken weeks to arrive from Guayaquil's port would now reach the capital in 2 days. Highland agricultural products could be exported through reliable transportation that made international commerce practical. People could travel between Ecuador's major cities without the danger and uncertainty that mule trails had imposed, and the nation that had existed as separate regions divided by mountains had become unified in ways that geography alone could never have achieved. But the celebration of completion carried within it the sombre acknowledgement of the cost. The railway had consumed 9 years of construction, had cost approximately $25 million that burdened Ecuador with foreign debt, and most tragically had claimed more than 2,000 lives among the workers who had built it. The death toll was imprecise because record-keeping had been incomplete. Many workers who died had been listed only by first names or by nicknames. Some bodies had been buried where they fell without formal documentation. The distinction between workers who died from construction accidents versus those who died from disease or other causes in the camps had been recorded inconsistently. But whether the true number was 2,000 or more, whether one counted only those who died in accidents directly related to railway work or included everyone who perished during the construction years, the human cost represented a tragedy that no amount of engineering achievement could fully justify or redeem. The workers themselves received little recognition in the completion celebrations. The speeches praised President Alfaro and the engineers and the foreign investors who had funded construction, but the Jamaican and Puerto Rican and Ecuadorian labourers who had hung from ropes drilling granite, who had handled dynamite on cliff faces, who had performed the dangerous physical work that transformed drawings into reality, were mentioned only in passing, if they were mentioned at all. The survivors among them had scattered. Some remained in Ecuador, having found work operating the railway they had built. Others had returned to Caribbean homes carrying wages earned through years of mountain labour. Still others had died not from construction accidents, but from diseases or altitude sickness, or simply from the accumulated toll of years spent working in conditions that depleted bodies faster than youth and strength could recover. How do you measure the value of 2,000 lives against the benefit of a railway that would serve the nation for generations? This question haunted some observers even during the 1908 celebrations. Journalists wrote articles asking whether the cost had been worth paying, whether a longer route that avoided the worst dangers might have been more humane even if more expensive, whether the workers had been adequately compensated and protected given the risks they were asked to accept. But these questions had no satisfactory answers. The dead couldn't be restored regardless of how much the living regretted their sacrifice. The railway existed as physical reality that immediately began generating economic benefits that would multiply across decades, and the workers who had accepted dangerous employment had done so through their own choices, even if those choices had been constrained by poverty that left accepting risk as the best available option. The railway's immediate impact exceeded even optimistic projections. Within months of opening, freight traffic grew to capacity as Highland. Coffee and cacao reached Guayaquil for export in quantities that mule trains had never been able to handle. Imported manufactured goods flowed to Quito and other highland cities at prices lower than when transportation costs had consumed much of the value. Passenger service connected families and businesses in ways that weeks-long mule journeys had prevented, and Ecuador's economy began growing at rates that reflected the transformation from geographical prison to connected nation. The travel time that had required 2 to 3 weeks by mule now took 2 days by train, a compression of time and distance that effectively moved Quito hundreds of kilometers closer to the coast, in practical terms, even though the physical geography remained unchanged. The railway continued operating through the decades that followed with modifications and improvements that reflected changing technology and needs. Steam locomotives eventually gave way to diesel engines that required less maintenance and operated more efficiently at high altitude. Passenger service evolved from basic carriages to more comfortable accommodations that made the journey less grueling. Maintenance practices improved as experience revealed which components needed more frequent attention, and the track itself received upgrades that allowed heavier loads and faster speeds than the original 1908 specifications had permitted. But the basic route remained unchanged. Trains still climbed the Devil's Nose through the switchback system that had represented the railway's signature innovation, still crossed the steel bridges that had been erected during construction's most dangerous phases, still followed the grade that workers had carved from cliff faces while hanging from ropes above fatal drops. By the 1990s, improved highways and bus service had reduced passenger traffic to levels where the railway struggled economically. Trucks could transport freight more flexibly than trains tied to fixed routes and schedules. Buses offered cheaper passage than railway tickets, and the infrastructure that had seemed so modern in 1908 now appeared outdated compared to the paved roads that connected Ecuador's cities. The railway company reduced service and eventually suspended regular operations. The tracks remained, but trains ran only occasionally. Stations fell into disrepair, and it seemed possible that the railway that had cost so much to build might simply be abandoned as Ecuador's transportation needs moved beyond what early 20th century technology could satisfy. But in the 2000s, recognition grew that the Devil's Nose Railway represented not just transportation infrastructure, but historical and cultural heritage worthy of preservation. The government invested in restoration that focused on the most dramatic sections, including the Devil's Nose switchbacks. Tourist services were developed that offered visitors the experience of riding through the famous reversals, and the railway gained new life as an attraction that drew visitors from around the world who wanted to witness what early 20th century engineering had accomplished in terrain that still looked impossible for railway operation. The tourist trains that now climb the Devil's Nose carry passengers who ride for the experience rather than for transportation need. They take photographs from the switchback platforms. They marvel at the cliff faces and gorges that the railway traverses. They try to imagine what it was like to build such a structure with 1900s technology and human labour. More than 115 years after its 1908 completion, the Devil's Nose Railway endures as testament to what human determination can accomplish when challenged by barriers that seem insurmountable. It stands as memorial to the 2,000 workers who died during construction and whose graves mark the route from coast to highlands. It functions as proof that engineering innovation guided by necessity can solve problems that conventional approaches cannot. And it serves as a reminder that some achievements cost more than money and time, that progress sometimes demands sacrifice that later generations benefit from but can never fully repay. The railway rests tonight beneath Andean stars, its steel rails still tracing the route that workers carved from granite, its bridges still spanning gorges that rivers carved millions of years before humans existed, its switchback platform still clinging to the Devil's Nose cliff that had blocked passage until determination and dynamite and lives offered in exchange created the pathway that transformed impossible into permanent reality that would outlast everyone who built it and everyone who questioned whether it could be done. The Devil's Nose Railway sleeps tonight as it has slept for more than a century. Its steel rails resting on granite shelves carved into cliffs that rise vertical from Andean valleys. Its bridges spanning gorges where rivers flow with the same timeless rhythm they followed long before humans imagined crossing such barriers. Its switchback platforms clinging to stone faces that had stood undisturbed for millions of years, until dynamite and determination convinced them to accept the impossible pathway. The sounds of night in these mountains blend with the silence that comes from altitude and remoteness. Perhaps wind moving through the gorges below, perhaps distant water rushing over rocks, perhaps nothing but the profound quiet that exists in places where nature dominates, and human presence remains temporary, even when that presence takes the form of steel and stone construction meant to last forever. The workers who built this railway have passed into history. The Jamaican labourers who left Caribbean homes seeking wages that might lift families from poverty. The Puerto Rican riggers who hung from ropes drilling holes for explosives while suspended above fatal drops. The Ecuadorian arrieros who guided mule trains carrying supplies through mountain trails. The engineers who designed solutions to problems that textbooks hadn't described. The telegraph operators who transmitted messages across distances that had once isolated communities completely. Their names appear in old construction records if they appear anywhere. Brief mentions in ledgers that recorded wages paid and work completed. Newspaper accounts of accidents that claimed lives. Company reports that treated workers as labour units, rather than as individuals with stories and dreams and families waiting for their return. More than 2,000 of those workers never returned. They rest in mountain cemeteries scattered along the railway route, buried where they fell or near the camps where they had lived during construction years, their graves marked by wooden crosses that weather has eroded or replaced by stones that local communities have maintained as informal memorials to people whose names have been forgotten, but whose contribution remains visible in every metre of track that climbs through the Andes. Some died in falls from cliff faces when ropes broke, or when exhaustion made them careless, their bodies tumbling hundreds of metres to rest at gorge bottoms, where recovery was impossible, and where they were buried by those who descended to honour them with whatever ceremony remote locations permitted. Others died in dynamite accidents when explosives detonated prematurely, or when blasts fractured rock in unexpected ways that sent debris flying at lethal velocities. Their deaths instantaneous, but their loss no less profound to the families who received news weeks later through telegrams that offered condolences, but no explanations that could make such deaths comprehensible. Still others died from altitude sickness that their Caribbean bodies couldn't adapt to, from diseases that swept through camps where sanitation was primitive and medical care inadequate, from injuries that proper hospitals might have treated successfully, but that camp facilities could only bandage while hoping for recovery that often never came, from simple exhaustion that accumulated across years of physical labor at elevations where thin air made every task harder, and where bodies depleted faster than rest and inadequate food could restore them. The railway remembers them all, not through conscious memory, but through the permanence of what they created together, through the track beds they carved and the bridges they erected, and the switchback platforms they blasted from granite that had resisted change until these workers arrived with tools and explosives, and the kind of determination that poverty and hope create, when they combine in circumstances that leave accepting danger as the best available option. The railway itself has outlasted its builders by more than a century. Trains still climb the Devil's Nose through the switchback reversals. Passengers still look out windows at cliff faces and gorges that inspire the same awe today that they created in 1908. Engineers still maintain the bridges and track sections that original construction created, with 1900s technology and methods. The steel has been replaced in sections where wear demanded renewal. The wooden ties have been changed countless times as wood aged and rotted in mountain weather. The locomotives that pull trains today bear no resemblance to the coal-fired steam engines that Baldwin Locomotive Works delivered for the railway's opening. But the basic structure remains what workers created during those 9 years of construction. The grade follows the route that survey teams mapped. The bridges span gorges at locations where original trestles stood, and the switchback platforms occupy the exact positions that were blasted into the Devil's Nose cliff through labour that contemporary observers recognised as among the most difficult railway construction ever attempted anywhere in the world. The railway's economic purpose has shifted across the decades since 1908. The freight traffic that justified the enormous investment and human cost has largely moved to highways that offer flexibility that railways cannot match. The passenger service that once transported thousands between coast and highlands has been reduced to tourist trains that run for experience rather than for transportation need, and the strategic importance that made Ecuador's leaders consider the railway essential to national development has faded as other infrastructure has provided alternative connections. Yet the railway endures not because it remains economically essential, but because it represents something beyond utility. It stands as testament to what human beings can accomplish when challenged by barriers that seem insurmountable, as memorial to workers who gave lives in service of ambitions that benefited others more than themselves, as proof that determination guided by engineering knowledge can indeed transform landscapes in ways that nature alone would never create. Imagine the railway tonight as darkness settles over the Andes, the tracks catching faint starlight, the bridges outlined against deeper darkness of gorges below, the switchback platforms resting on cliff faces that drop away into shadows where depth cannot be measured by sight alone. The railway asks nothing. It doesn't demand recognition for its difficulty or praise for its innovation or remembrance of those who died creating it. It simply exists as it has existed for more than 115 years, ready to carry trains when trains arrive, patient during periods when no locomotives climb its grades, permanent in the way that careful construction combined with regular maintenance can achieve permanence despite the forces of weather and time that work constantly to reclaim human structures for the natural world. The mountains that the railway crosses remain fundamentally unchanged. The peaks still rise to elevations that create altitude, sickness in those unaccustomed to thin air. The gorges still drop to depths that inspire vertigo in those who look down from bridges. The Devil's Nose still presents itself as a vertical wall of granite that would prevent passage if not for the switchback shelves carved into its face. But the human relationship to these mountains has transformed completely. What once represented an insurmountable barrier that kept coast and highlands separate has become a dramatic landscape that tourists visit to photograph and experience. What once cost 2,000 lives to cross has become a journey that passengers complete in comfort, while marvelling at the engineering that made such crossing possible. And what once symbolized geographical imprisonment has become a source of national pride in Ecuador's ability to overcome challenges that expert engineers had declared beyond solution. As sleep approaches, let the image of the railway carry you into rest. Picture the tracks climbing through darkness, following the route that workers carve from stone, crossing bridges that span empty air above rivers flowing far below. The railway doesn't move tonight. No trains disturb its rest. No locomotives labour up its grades. No passengers press against windows to observe views that daylight makes spectacular. The railway simply waits, as it has waited through countless nights, as it will wait through countless more, existing as permanent connection between places that geography tried to keep separate, but that human determination refused to leave divided. The workers who built this railway sleep in mountain graves, their labour complete, their struggles ended, their contribution lasting far beyond the years they lived to witness it. They transformed impossible into real through 9 years of dangerous work that tested courage and endurance and skill in ways that comfortable observers could never fully comprehend. They hung from ropes above fatal drops. They handled explosives that could kill without warning. They worked at altitudes where breathing was difficult and where exhaustion was constant. They accepted dangers that should have turned them back, but that they pushed through because wages mattered and because someone had to build the impossible railway if it was ever going to exist. Rest now. Let the thought of the railway bring peace rather than tension. Let the image of tracks climbing through darkness become a pathway toward your own sleep. The Devil's Nose. Railway will stand through this night as it has stood through more than 115 years of nights. Steady, silent, permanent. A structure built by human hands but destined to outlast all who built it and all who ride it and all who remember the names of those who died creating it. The mountains hold the railway in their ancient embrace. The stone that workers blasted still supports the tracks. The gorges that bridges span still carry their rivers toward the distant ocean, and somewhere in the darkness, the railway rests, patient and permanent, proof that what seems impossible remains impossible only until someone finds the courage and the method to make it real. Sleep well. The railway watches over the mountains, connecting coast to highlands, spanning barriers that nature created, carrying forward the legacy of workers who built something meant to last forever, quiet and strong and enduring, a permanent pathway through impossible terrain, testament to human determination, memorial to human sacrifice, bridge across time that links past builders to present travellers to future generations who will ride this same route and wonder how such a thing was ever built, and whether the people who built it understood that their work would outlast empires and technologies, and all the changes that a century brings to nations and to the world that railways help to connect. The devil's nose stands in darkness. The railway clings to its face, and both rest peacefully beneath Andean stars, eternal and unchanging, waiting for dawn that will bring new travellers, but content for now in the quiet of night, in the silence that comes from altitude and isolation, in the peace that difficult work completed brings to structures that have proven their worth through more than a century of service. Sleep well. The mountains are patient. The railway endures, and the night welcomes you to rest as deeply as the stone that holds the tracks that climb where climbing shouldn't be possible, but where human determination carved a pathway anyway, and where that pathway remains forever.